You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Todd and Paul. I am Todd Wood.
And I'm Paul Garner.
And we are here to start a new series this morning. Now, before you think, how many intermittent series do you people have? Because we have too many. Yes, that's true. But this series is actually going to be consecutive. It's going to be another one like we did when we did the Flood Boundary series, where we had a number of episodes just one right after the other. So this is going to be a 3-part series. And before we get started, before we get into all the detail on that, I want to let you know that this was made possible. This series was made possible by a generous donation from one of our audience members, so thank you to that person. He chose to remain anonymous, but thank you so much for your support. Remember that we produce this podcast continuously. Other podcasts produce seasons. They take breaks, like sane people would do. But Paul and I are just like, yeah, let's just keep going. So we're up to 100 and some episodes now. We're well over 110 episodes. And it's one right after the other. And it's a lot of resources that we invest into this, a lot of time researching the episodes, a lot of time doing production on the episodes and so forth. And it's costly, and we do appreciate all of the contributions. And another way that you can support us is simply by liking this video if you're on YouTube watching, subscribing to our podcast wherever you are listening to your podcasts. You can share us on social media. We are also on social media. You can find us there. And that way you help us to grow our audience. And every time we add members to our audience, we're going to add possible supporters in the future. So we appreciate that very much. So as I said, today we're starting off this new series. As usual, this is a complicated episode, so I've got my trusty notes here on my phone. So if you see me staring off and squinting at something, well, you know what I'm doing again. So in this episode, this series of episodes, we're going to talk about the recovery of the earth after the flood. That's basically our subject. That was what we were asked to do. We were asked to talk about, how the earth recovered, how the animals and plants recovered, and specifically dispersal. Now, that's a big subject, as you might guess. So we decided we'd split it up into 3 episodes because it's such a big thing. So in the first episode here, we want to cover sort of the physical environment, how the earth changed, and how the climate changed after the flood. Then in the second episode, the next episode, we're going to cover how creatures changed. So creationists have this idea about diversification of created kinds after the flood, and that will be our subject for next episode. And then finally, we're going to get into the dispersal question. How do you get platypus down to, Tasmania and Australia and so forth? Those kinds of questions we'll try to deal with here on the third episode. Actually, we're not going to tell you about the platypus, but we are going to give you a big framework to help you understand how the platypus might be explicable. So this is a 3-part series. Now we don't usually tell you exactly what's going to be on the next episode, but this time, now you have a roadmap for the next 4 weeks. So that'll be great. Paul, did I cover everything?
Well, we've covered a lot of this kind of material, haven't we, in previous episodes? And viewers and listeners might want to check out some of those episodes. So we've already done episodes about things like the Ice Age. We had Steve Gollmer on to talk about that. We've talked about created kinds, sort of introduced the whole concept of kinds and diversification. You mentioned the series we did on the flood boundary. That's kind of relevant to this whole topic. recently we, of course, had that episode about Mount St. Helens, and we're going to come back to Mount St. Helens in this episode. So, there are lots of things that we've kind of covered, but what we haven't done is we haven't sort of put the jigsaw pieces together to make the big picture. And so that's kind of what we want to do, I think, in this series, is try and draw some of these threads together and sort of paint the broad brush picture of the post-flood world, so that people sort of get the overall sort of framework. So that's what we're planning to do.
All right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, we have covered a lot of this information. As I was sort of making notes for this episode, I realized, there's so much. There's so much that we've already done, and we've never really put it all together. All right. So how about we start out here with the flood itself? So our regular viewers and listeners, they know we've talked about this in the past. They probably know a lot about the flood. How about, Paul, you just sort of give us sort of a brief reminder of how modern creationists perceive the actual flood?
Yeah, sure. So, well, let's go back sort of maybe 200 years ago. I'm not going to talk at length about this. This is But 200 years ago, I think people tended to think of the flood pretty much as they would think of any sort of regular flood. You know, the rains came down, the water rose, covered the land.
That's how the song goes. The rains came down and the floods ran up. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, simplistic kind of picture. And there were a number of people who would have identified the deposits of the flood with what we now know are the glacial deposits. So people were looking at glacial sediments, glacial tills, and they were interpreting that as evidence of the flood. Of course, when the glacial theory came along, that kind of blew that idea out of the water, and there was resistance to the glacial theory, in fact, because people were sort of wedded to this idea that those superficial deposits were actually the flood deposits. Early 20th century, George Macready Price comes along. We talked about him back in the episodes we did on the geological column. Mm-hmm. And he kind of revived the whole idea of flood geology as an explanation for essentially the entirety of the geological record. So that was early 20th century. 1961, of course, Whitcomb and Morris come along with the Genesis Flood, which really is the book that launches the whole of the modern creationist revival. And what's really interesting about that is the same decade that the Genesis Flood is published, what comes along but plate tectonics. The theory that we now know as plate tectonics is the pieces are kind of put together throughout the 1960s. And again, there was creationist resistance to the idea of plate tectonics. You see that going on through the 60s, 70s, into the 80s, even the early 90s. But it actually turns out that plate tectonics was the key to helping us sort of solve many of the problems surrounding the Genesis Flood. And one of those problems is that if you look at the modern world, there basically isn't enough water to flood the present day Earth. In order to flood the Earth, you would need to reduce the volume of the ocean basins, in effect shallow the ocean basins, and lower the height of the mountains in order for the water to be able to cover the whole planet, the water that we have on the Earth presently. So how could that happen? Well, it turns out plate tectonics gives us a way to do that, actually gives us a mechanism. And so now, really beginning sort of in the early 90s, and then 94, I think it was, the catastrophic plate tectonics was proposed based on the earlier work of John Baumgardner on this thing called runaway subduction. The idea is that the pre-flood ocean floor sank rapidly into the Earth's interior. New ocean floor generated at the mid-ocean ridges. And so the ocean floor is moving like a conveyor belt during the flood and dragging the continents around. So the continents are being separated, pulled apart, crashing together, colliding, forming mountains, changing the shape of the ocean basins. So the flood, as we understand it today, is this really dynamic event. It's not like the children's storybook where, the rain comes down and the water rises.
Right.
This is a massive sort of tectonic catastrophe. So we think now of the flood as not as a kind of tranquil event, but rather as an event that reshaped the entire surface of our planet. So that's kind of the current creation perspective.
Yeah, yeah, and it's kind of mind-boggling too. I mean, you think about a regular flood. We've had a lot of rain here in East Tennessee the past couple of weeks, and yeah, there's been some flooding. There's been some creeks rising and so forth, but it seems tame compared to what you're describing here. This is a catastrophe like no other, and the water is just one part of it, right? It's just one element that gets involved in the larger disaster, which involves all of this runaway subduction. Now, when we talk about runaway subduction, this isn't a thing that you can just, let's say, turn on and off like you do a light switch, right? So you turn your light switch on, the lights come on, turn the light switch off. There, it's dark again. This is not. It doesn't work like that. And I imagine that it could work in a way that there's a sudden slowing. So for example, if you once you get the original pre-flood ocean floor completely gone, I imagine that it could slow down quite a bit, maybe. I don't know. There are ways to imagine some major changes in velocity or intensity, but things are not just going to go back to normal with that kind of a disaster. Even in Genesis, as you read through it, I mean, you see, in Genesis 8, so God makes a wind blow over the earth and the waters subsided. Then the waters receded continuously. And at the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. Then in the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And then the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. So the whole process of the end of the flood, it's not like, the rain stopped and then the ark landed and then Noah got off. It's this massive long period of time where Noah's basically just sitting there. The rain has indeed stopped, but he's just hanging around, waiting for this, waiting for, to be the go ahead to get off the ark, waiting for that dry ground to appear.
Yeah. So you can kind of think of the end of the flood, as the point at which Noah and his family and the animals, leave the ark. But the aftershocks of the flood are going to go on for centuries. In fact, in many ways, you could say they're still going on. We're still kind of living with the after effects of the flood. So, think about the tectonic movements that we've talked about there during the flood. You're talking about volcanic activity on an unimaginable scale, so much bigger than anything that we see happening in the present day. And all of that catastrophic tectonics, including the replacement of the ocean floor, is going to have some ongoing effects, right? So one of the effects is that it's going to warm the oceans. The temperature of the oceans is going to increase because of all this catastrophic activity. So at the end of the flood, the oceans are going to be much warmer than at the present day. And all of this volcanic activity is going to put aerosols, particles into the atmosphere, things like sulfur compounds like sulfur dioxide and so on. Also, there's going to be a transition at the end of the flood. So during the flood, as the plates are separating, we've talked about this kind of conveyor belt type effect. The tectonic movements are predominantly going to be horizontal, with plates that are moving horizontally apart. But what's going to happen when that slows down and things begin to get back to some kind of new equilibrium? Well, there's going to be what geologists call isostatic readjustments, where crust is going to be bobbing up and down. There are going to be bits of crust that have been depressed during the flood that are going to bounce back. And there are going to be other parts which are elevated, which are going to sink down. So you're going to get lots of these kind of vertical adjustments. And of course, during all of that, there are going to be earthquakes and volcanoes, again, on a scale unlike anything that we see today. And when we look at the geological record, of course, we see evidence of this kind of massive scale of processes. There are things called supervolcanoes. They're in North America. You've got the Yellowstone supervolcano, which erupted multiple times in the relatively recent geological past through what we think of as the post-flood period. And those eruptions were enormous. We talked recently about Mount St. Helens, and that was a devastating event. It erupted huge quantities of ash, but the ash that was erupted by Mount St. Helens covered maybe 22,000 square miles, something like that.
That's a lot.
Well, that's a lot. That's a lot. It covered parts of 6 states.
Yep.
And, it's about a cubic kilometer of ash. But some of the Yellowstone eruptions were much larger. So some of the ash falls from the Yellowstone volcano cover 1.3 million square miles. That's almost 60 times the area covered by the Mount St. Helens ash. So, and often those ash beds are much thicker than the ash from modern volcanoes. So, yeah, so we're talking about really unimaginable processes. And Todd, you've been to a site where you can see some evidence of this, I understand.
Yeah. So I've been to this one twice. I was there in the 90s and I came back about 20 years later. So Ashfall Fossil Beds, which is a site in basically northish, I guess north central Nebraska. I don't really know my Nebraska geography. Sorry, Nebraskans, but it's somewhere in the north. It's about 3 hours out of Lincoln. And this is where there is ash from one of those Yellowstone supervolcanic eruptions. And the ash is very thick. It can be as deep as 5 to 6 feet in places. So it's pretty insane. The researchers think it was once a watering hole, and it's full of basically mostly rhinoceros skeletons, complete skeletons. The rhinos there's evidence that they lived in this ash for a while, and then many of them just sort of laid down there and just died, and then became covered by more ash, and then preserved, and then it's pretty remarkable. So now there's excavation at the site, and most of it's being just left in the ground. They're excavating it in a way that visitors can come into this big, they call the rhino barn, and they can look at the animals still there in the ground, and they can see the ash layer and so forth. It's pretty impressive, but it's kind of crazy to think, it's 1,000 miles from that eruption center in the Yellowstone system to north central Nebraska, there where Ashfall is, and it's still 6 feet of ash. I mean, that's a crazy amount of ash. That's a crazy amount of erupting. So as we think about Mount St. Helens and how that eruption changed things, that's barely a scale model of what Yellowstone was doing. Now, another thing that was happening at Mount St. Helens that we talked about was all those debris flows that picked up all that material and swept it away. We talked about the forest there north of the mountain. And if you look on Google Earth, we always tell people to go check out Google Earth, because you can still see the devastation of Mount St. Helens on Google Earth, 45 years later. And you can see how much of that forest north of the mountain there was leveled. And that left a lot of logs, as we mentioned, still floating in Spirit Lake there. Now that gives us a framework to help us understand ancient forests. So Paul, can you fill us in on the details of that?
Yeah. So one of the most famous fossil forests that people might have heard of is actually found within Yellowstone National Park. You've been there. There's a place called Specimen Ridge, where you can climb up this very steep ridge, and you will find exposed in the hillside layer after layer after layer of petrified trees standing upright, giving the impression, that they kind of grew there, sort of eroding out of the hillside. But when you look at the trees there at Yellowstone, there are some strange things about the trees. So they're kind of short and stumpy. They're missing their branches. And when you dig around the base, the roots are gone. So this is strange. Well, we get some insight, don't we, at Mount St. Helens, because there at Spirit Lake, that mature forest that was growing on the slopes of Mount St. Helens got swept into Spirit Lake, into the basin of the lake, where those logs then floated on the surface of the lake. In fact, many of them still floating today. 45 years later, they cover about a square mile of the surface of the lake. And because they were kind of swept into the lake during this eruption, the branches have been broken off these trees, and the roots have all been broken, and the bark has, been dislodged from these trees. So you've got these kind of truncated trees that are floating there in the lake. And what happens is, as they get waterlogged, the base of the tree often is the densest part of the tree, and because there's the root ball there, the logs will swing into an upright position with the base, downwards. And as they get more waterlogged, they will sink down to the floor of the lake, where they kind of eventually settle there on the floor of the lake, still standing upright.
Right.
So if you drain Spirit Lake, it would give the appearance of a forest of trees, trees that had grown there, but they didn't grow there. They were swept by this sort of debris flow into the lake. And when we look at Specimen Ridge, it seems that what we have at Mount St. Helens is a kind of a modern day, small scale analog of what we see on a larger scale there at Yellowstone with the trees at Specimen Ridge.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. I've been there, and that's pretty much how it is. I mean, there are some roots in certain places on some of the trees, but it's not like an extensive root system. You're not going to find big tap roots. You're not going to find, the big network of roots that you would find on a modern tree. It looks, like you say, that they've been knocked down and the roots have been broken off. And the other thing that really struck me about that when I visited there was how easily even I, a non-geologist, I just fake geology. I pick up words that you and other geologists I know talk about, so I sound pretty impressive, but I am not a geologist. But even I, looking at this deposit, could see this is a catastrophic flow. It's full of debris, logs and branches and twigs and rocks. It's just a mess. So it's not just that you have these logs, these stumps eroding up out of the hillside there, but you have a hillside that's basically really obviously a mess. It's a catastrophic flow. So we mentioned volcanoes. We mentioned supervolcanoes as evidence of some of the catastrophes that are happening after the flood. And we should also point out here, Specimen Ridge is a long way up. If you've not been there, we hiked it. I don't know, a couple of years ago, decade ago maybe. It was really insanely steep. And it's quite a high elevation off of even the road, the valley where the road goes. So that gives you a sense of how much water there must have been there in order for those stumps to land upright when that debris flow happened. Now, you also mentioned at the very beginning, we're gonna rewind here just a second here, when you were describing the various changes on the earth after the flood, you mentioned warm oceans.
Yeah.
Now, maybe you can help us understand what we might expect from a warming ocean. That's kind of a big concern nowadays, but I think this is warming ocean on a much bigger scale. So maybe you could help us parse through that.
Yeah. So we think that by the end of the flood, the ocean's going to be much, much warmer than today, because of all of this catastrophic tectonic activity. And one of the things we know about warm water is that it evaporates much more quickly than cold water. And so if the oceans at the end of the flood were many degrees warmer than today, there would be a huge amount of evaporation from the surface of the post-flood oceans. And that moisture, which would be sort of pumped in effect into the Earth's atmosphere, as the air circulates over the continents, it would fall as precipitation. You would get rainfall, and when things were cold enough, snow. And one of the things that we do see in the post-flood record over the continents is evidence that there was once things were much wetter. There was a lot more water around. We have evidence of large inland lakes, even inland seas, you might describe them. Western North America, for example, has lots of evidence of former bodies of water that are no longer there, or at least where we only have sort of smaller remnants left. So one example is Great Salt Lake in Utah, which, our viewers will be familiar with. Now, the level of Great Salt Lake in the present day fluctuates quite a bit. The lake level changes, but it typically covers an area of about 1,000 square miles. But we know that Great Salt Lake is actually a small remnant of a much larger body of water that we call Lake Bonneville. And Lake Bonneville, at its greatest extent, covered more than 22,000 square miles, so much, much larger than the modern Great Salt Lake. We see remnants of other lakes in northern Arizona and eastern Utah, which we think eventually drained out through the Colorado River, the valley of the Colorado River. In fact, we think that it was the catastrophic draining of these large lakes there in Arizona that effectively cut through that high upwarped area known as the Kaibab Upwarp in northern Arizona to form the current Grand Canyon. So we think that was catastrophically carved as that dam was breached and the water sort of cascaded out through that high uplifted plateau area.
Yeah, I've heard creationists, or regular church going folk, talk about the flood as being the cause of the Grand Canyon, not millions of years of erosion. And I get that, right? You want to distinguish between the conventional model and the creationist model, but it is a bit oversimplified, because what you're describing is something that happens actually quite a bit after the flood. You have to have time for basically the continents to settle down, the sediments to sort of semi-consolidate into rock, and then the waters are building up upstream of the canyon, and then they breach through and carve the actual hole in the ground that we think of as the canyon. And that's something, that building up of water, that's part of what's happening because of the warm oceans after the flood. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Okay.
So if you think about, if you could fill in the Grand Canyon, you would have this big sort of uplifted plateau that was a natural dam.
Mm-hmm.
And to the east of that natural dam, there is in effect a basin or a series of basins that would naturally have kind of collected water. If you had very high levels of evaporation from the oceans and high levels of precipitation, they would have basically filled with water. And we see evidence of that. Steve Austin has been finding evidence of ancient shorelines that once belonged to this lake. There are lake sediments out there. But eventually, at some point, that dam was breached. There was a kind of an overspill event, and those lakes, that series of interconnected lakes, catastrophically drained out, carving through that uplifted area to create the Grand Canyon itself. And again, at Mount St. Helens, we kind of see that on a smaller scale, because there we see examples of canyons that were carved by mud flows that were eroded very, very quickly, even through, consolidated bedrock. So we know that it's possible to catastrophically erode canyons in a relatively short space of time.
Right. Yeah. Now, you mentioned evidence. You mentioned Steve Austin going out and finding shorelines. Maybe you can give us another example of a lake that's, was there at one time and is no longer.
Yeah. So a lake that existed a bit earlier in the post-flood period is what we call Fossil Lake in southern Wyoming. We find there evidence of lake deposits that fill basins. So, you have, in effect, thicker sediments in the middle of the basin and thinner sediments out to the margins of the basin. And the sediments are distributed in a kind of concentric bullseye sort of pattern centered on the basin. We have evidence around the margins of those basins of deltas that were running into the lake. So there were deltas that were sort of feeding sediments into the lake. Within those sediments, we find lots of fossils, particularly fossil fish, very famous for the fossil fish that this deposit contains. John Whitmore, who has been a guest on our show from Cedarville University, John did his PhD studying the fossil fish from this deposit and showing that they basically have the features of fish carcasses that were decomposing for some time before they were finally buried. So you can see fish in different states of decomposition. So they were presumably, some of them were lying around for a while before they got buried. The remains of this lake, we actually call it now the Green River Formation. And it's a great place to look for fish fossils and other types of fossils too. And you can go to Fossil Butte National Monument, and that's in the Green River Formation. So that's another example of an early post-flood lake.
Right. Yeah. And if you ever get a chance to talk to John Whitmore about his research, his doctoral dissertation, it's great, because if you're wondering how he knows how long fish have been laying there rotting, well, buckets and dead fish. That's how he knows.
Yep.
He had buckets of dead fish just sitting around, and he made observations about what happened to their bodies as they decomposed. It's a lovely, lovely project. So that's how he knows. Anyway, so Paul, one of the earliest things that I remember learning as a creationist, as a young student way back in the early 90s, was the Ice Age. And we've talked about this on the podcast before. This is pretty well known among creationists, I would think. Can you help us understand then the big picture of how the Ice Age then fits into what we think of as the post-flood period? How does that work?
Yeah, well, when we think about the Ice Age, you actually need a pretty unique set of circumstances. The first thing you need, obviously, is lots of precipitation, specifically snowfall, because you have to have enough snow building up to get compacted to form ice, to begin to accumulate an ice sheet. But it's no good if the snowfall in the winter melts during the summer. You won't build up an ice sheet that way. You've got to somehow have the snowfall survive through the summer months so that it can accumulate year on year on year on year in order to build up an ice sheet. And that's a very peculiar set of circumstances. You can't have things too cold because you've got to have enough moisture in the atmosphere to produce the snowfall. And you have to have much higher rates of snowfall than in the modern day. But you've also got to have very cold summers so that snowfall survives. Now, the flood actually helps us here because we've already said, haven't we, that at the end of the flood, the oceans were quite warm. And one of the things we said about warm oceans is that it promotes evaporation. So you have much more evaporation from the surface of the oceans after the flood. This provides a supply of moisture, pumping moisture into the atmosphere that can then circulate over the continents and fall when conditions are cold enough, can fall as snow. one of the other things that we have is because of all the volcanic activity that was going on during the flood and in the aftermath of the flood, we have an atmosphere that is being supplied with volcanic sulfates, particulate matter. And to explain what the effect of these volcanic sort of aerosols are, I want to tell you about a historic eruption, the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815. I don't know how many of our viewers and listeners have heard of Tambora. Some of them may have done. It was a volcano on an island in what's today Indonesia, the island of Sumbawa. The mountain had sort of been active; it had been rumbling and smoking for a number of years. But in April 1815, there was this massive eruption of the volcano. It was so big that the eruption could be heard 2,000 miles away. So this was a very large eruption. Destroyed every living thing on the island. And because of all of the ash and the sulfates, all of that particulate matter that was kind of ejected into the atmosphere during the eruption, global temperatures fell by about 0.5 degree Celsius. And there were some really unusual weather conditions as a consequence of this. So in June of 1816, which of course in the Northern Hemisphere, that's our summer, there was snow in June in New York, in New England. The town of Cabot in Vermont had 18 inches of snow. Quebec City in Canada had 12 inches of snow. Crops across the United States failed. Tens of thousands of people suffered from starvation. Tens of thousands of people died. And 1816 became known as the year without a summer. So that was the consequence of this eruption. And it was a large eruption. It was the largest eruption that we know of, for which we have a historical record. But actually, Tambora was really quite small compared to some of the eruptions that we know happened during the flood and in the aftermath of the flood. We talked, didn't we, about those sort of super volcano eruptions. But if a volcano like Tambora there in Indonesia could produce all of this disruption, all of this climatic sort of chaos, imagine what the world would have been like, how the atmosphere of the world would have been affected by these massive sort of volcanoes during and immediately after the flood. So I think that gives us a kind of a unique set of circumstances where we've got these oceans, which are much warmer than today, producing lots of moisture, but we also have a mechanism to cool the continents, for the temperatures over the continents to plummet. So you have this kind of perfect combination that can explain the rapid accumulation of ice during that early post-flood period.
And that's our model of the Ice Age, basically, is that the warm oceans from the flood drove huge amounts of precipitation, and the mess in the atmosphere then kept the air temperatures cold enough that they would fall as snow at weird times of the year. Is that basically how it goes?
Yeah, that's basically our working model. We think that these unusual conditions are what would have precipitated this ice age. And of course, we know there was an ice age because we have evidence that the ice has left behind in the landscapes around us. So, if you think about sort of mountainous regions that have been glaciated, we see evidence of erosional features, carving of ice. So up in the mountains, you can find these semicircular basins. We sometimes refer to them as corries. That's where mountain glaciers were sort of born, if you like, before they spill down into the valleys. And the valleys, we have these deep, steep-sided, U-shaped valleys. Traditional river valleys, they're kind of V-shaped, but glacial valleys have a kind of flat bottom, steep sides. They're more sort of U-shaped, where the ice has steepened and over deepened the river valley. We have evidence of polished and grooved surfaces where debris in the ice has left scratch marks, striations on stone pavements. And we see this kind of evidence over broad swathes of the northern hemisphere. So much of Scandinavia and the Baltic states was glaciated. The glaciers covered much of the UK, where I live, and Ireland, all of Iceland and Greenland. There in North America, Canada was mostly glaciated. Most of that was covered in ice. The ice extended down into the northern US, covered New England, Michigan, many of those other sort of Midwestern states. And then we also see around the kind of the margins where the lowland areas where the margins of the ice sheets were. We also find lots of evidence of glacial deposition, often in the form of what we call glacial till. Till is a sediment composed of, it's a kind of unsorted mixture of cobbles and boulders of various kinds in a sandy or clay-rich sort of matrix. And it's deposited by the ice or by glacial meltwater. And often that glacial debris forms ridges of till that we call moraines that mark where the edges of the glacier were. So the snout and the edges of the glacier. There are sinuous ridges called eskers, which were probably deposited by meltwater that was either running in channels underneath the glacier or even within or on top of the glacier. We have these sort of oval, streamlined hills of glacial debris called drumlins. You often find them in swarms where lots of these things all occur together. There are also perched boulders or erratics, where you have a big boulder that's kind of sitting there, maybe on top of bare bedrock, but it doesn't match the bedrock. It's been transported from somewhere else. So, it maybe matches bedrock, many miles, even hundreds of miles distant. So we have all of this evidence of the effects of the ice on the landscape around us. So we can be confident that there really was this time when much of the northern hemisphere was covered with ice.
Yeah. Okay. So time for another story. So as some of our audience members may know, I grew up in southern Michigan, just north of the Ohio border as far as Michigan goes. It's a big state. And our house was situated in farm country there, and there was a little village not maybe a mile and a half away from our house. And between me and the village was this massive hill. And I remember many times growing up, riding my bike down to the village, and you'd have to push your bike up the one side because it was so steep, and then you'd enjoy the fast ride down the other. And when I grew up, I found out this was the remains of an esker. The whole area there where I grew up is full of glacial remains. And, people talk about how flat the Midwest is. And I always thought, I don't know what you're talking about. We live in very steep hill country here. We have this massive hill, and it's all this glacial stuff. Anyway, yeah. So that esker there covers about 3.5 square miles. So it's relatively big, but it's also, on the grand scale of things, pretty small. It doesn't even have a name. Other eskers there in my local area there, they have names, but this one was it's just an esker. It's just too small to even name it. But seemed huge to me when I was 10 and riding my bike around.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, we've got very similar sort of ridges and mounds around the area where I live, many of them glacial in origin. So that's interesting. So why don't we recap then what we've said in this episode? We've talked about the flood and the fact that it was this dramatic tectonic event. We've talked about the consequences for the earth after Noah and his family and the animals left the ark. They would have had to deal with decades, maybe centuries of violent aftershocks, ongoing catastrophic events, massive volcanoes, huge earthquakes, very strange climate, very weird things happening with the climate of the earth, leading to lots of precipitation. The early post-flood period was probably very, very wet. And that gave us these huge inland bodies of water, many of which then drained to leave either remnants of lakes today or even sort of carving huge canyons. And of course, eventually, much of that precipitation fell across the mid to high latitudes as snow, and eventually sort of culminated in this event that we call the Ice Age. So the post-flood period was not a pleasant time to live through. When Noah comes off the ark and he's given that rainbow promise, and God says he's never going to flood the earth again, he's never going to destroy the earth again with a flood. We sort of sometimes gloss over that, but I think that was a promise Noah needed to hang on to at times in that very unsettled time that he had to live through after the flood.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, when you think about how big the flood had to be, and the way the earth recovered, yeah, you're absolutely right. You would need to reassure them that things are going to get bad, but it's never going to be as bad as it was. I think there's one more point we should probably make before we sort of wrap this up. So I hear some creationists recently who have been kind of critical of this model, and some of them have even sort of scoffed at the things that we described here. And honestly, I don't see how we have much room for scoffing. The way the flood happened, the way the flood had to happen, is for that to be a tectonic event, like you say. It's the only way you get, for example, the majority of the fossil record as part of flood deposits. It's the only way to level off the mountains and raise the ocean floor so you can actually get a global flood that covers all of the earth with water. That's the only way to do it. That's the only way to get this massive. Otherwise, you're going to have God just creating extra water and then making it just magically disappear. You basically have a fairy tale God who just does whatever he wants whenever he wants to, which is a very... I don't know how we live in that universe. if God can just... Well, I mean, he can, but the idea that the flood has an explanation makes science, I think, possible. Otherwise, how do you explain any of this stuff? And the residual catastrophism that we've described here is going to happen when you have a disaster of that scale. And it doesn't matter, the kinds of little internecine debates that we fight about, where the flood boundary goes and all that stuff, and whether this is exactly deposited in the flood or whether it's deposited after the flood. Those are important. I don't want to dismiss that, and I don't want to diminish the value of those things. But at the same time, they're kind of the trivia that sort of hangs on the larger story. And the larger story is a massive tectonic flood that unleashes this sort of decades and centuries of this post-flood mess. And I think that, if we're going to reject that, as I say, we're going to have to basically go back and rebuild the entire model of the flood, and the entire model of the fossil record and all of it. It just all has to be redone because it's all connected together. It's all intertwined. So, you can scoff at this, but you're basically shooting yourself in the foot. And that's my opinion. You don't have to believe me. Obviously, I'm just one dude. What do I know? But I think we're going to wrap that episode up with that. So we'll be back in 2 weeks then to continue our series on what happened after the flood. So this is the environment and geology and so forth, and how that is changing after the flood. Next time, we're going to talk about species and kinds and how they're changing after the flood. And then in part 3, a month from now, we're going to talk about the biogeography issues, how animals dispersed and changed their locations and settled down into new places after the flood. And so with that, let's call this all done. Thanks for checking us out. Don't forget to like this and subscribe. And we'll see you in 2 weeks for diversification.
See See you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.